Charlotte Abbott had ridden without pause for 3 days before the silhouette of Cottonwood Creek finally filled the horizon and slipped into view, and although both rider and horse were worn to the bone, Charlotte kept her posture straight in the saddle because an upright figure invited respect, while any hint of weakness invited trouble. The mare, a dependable mare whose name was Silver, strode steadily beneath her, every muscle that remained steady a quiet testament to the miles they'd covered. Cottonwood Creek itself was a small place, more of a cluster than a town, a scattering of sun-bleached wood and metal buildings that huddled around the crossroads as if seeking shelter from the relentless sky. A few residents stood aside on the wooden boardwalks to watch the newcomer pass. Curiosity and suspicion are neighbors in small places. Charlotte had learned long ago to meet that curiosity with a guarded calm. The past year had been a steady drift from one dusty settlement to the next, never quite setting down roots, always looking for something that remained unnamed even in the quiet hours. She stopped outside a building that looked like a saloon and tied Silver to the post, feeling the stiffness in her legs after so many days in the saddle. A boy with sunburned cheeks and a knife in hand whittled quietly on the bench nearby and flicked his eyes up when she approached. A penny changed hands as they spoke, dropped into the boy's palm with the casual confidence of someone used to making small exchanges stretch into larger possibilities. "Work," the boy said, "depends on what kind of work is needed around here. Courthouse postings might have something." Charlotte thanked him and set off down the street, knowing from long experience that the courthouse was the place where the town's official business and its quieter rumors both gathered. The courthouse itself looked grander than the town required, its brick face almost out of place beside the dust and the weathered paint of the surrounding buildings. Inside, the public notice board carried the usual assortment of announcements, legal notices, and the kind of wanted posters that belong to a world where law and frontier overlap. Charlotte's eye drifted across familiar notices until something unusual halted her breath and pulled her forward. There on the board was a notice that read like a trick: property available. Willow Creek Ranch, approximately 300 acres, structures included. Sale price $1, property sold as is. Buyer assumes all liability. Inquire with county clerk, room 12. The paper seemed absurd at a glance. No reasonable ranch sold for $1. The thought that this must be a mistake or the final flourish of some mischief maker spun in Charlotte's mind, but another instinct, a quieter one that had become a lodestar, nudged her forward. Curiosity became action. The clerk who sat behind the counter in room 12 was thin and bespectacled in the kind of way that made him look permanently surprised. He set his spectacles down on the desk and regarded Charlotte with a tilt that suggested he preferred paperwork over people, yet his face softened into something like sympathy when he realized she stood alone. "The listing is real," he admitted after Charlotte's question. Then, because small towns keep the stories behind their formal notices like coals beneath a lid, he told the tale that explained the price. 3 families had tried to settle that ranch in 5 years and each had fled before a season ended. Accidents, disappearances of tools, lights in the night, animals spooked for unknown reasons, encounters that made even practical people murmur about bad luck. The county was tired of paying taxes on empty land. The low price was a way of passing ownership, along with the hope that someone would step up to claim responsibility. Charlotte listened to the clerk's catalogue of oddities with a pulse that moved between skepticism and a strange, quiet hope. "What kind of strange occurrences?" she asked, pressing for detail because the mind wants particulars even when the answer might be rare comfort. The clerk shrugged and offered the anecdotes he had heard and could not confirm. Shadows moving where there should be none, a family who swore the barn doors swung when no wind passed through, cattle found in paddocks miles away despite solid fences. The clerk's tone wavered between professional distance and a hint that superstition ran thick through the region. To him it was nonsense, to others it was reason enough to look elsewhere. Charlotte did not come here for legends, though she possessed a patience for them. She came for land, for the idea of a place to name as her own at last. Before she realized the thought had hardened into a decision, the words were out of her lips. She'll take the place. The clerk blinked at the suddenness and then slid a deed across the desk with a quickness that suggested the county was prepared for someone brave or desperate enough to accept the terms. 20 minutes later, Charlotte walked out with a legal document bearing the name and the description of 300 acres she had never seen. It was both absurdly small and enormously heavy. Absurdly small because the price she paid was $1, heavy because of the responsibility now tied to her hands. Ownership is a strange weight to shoulder when one has known only the temporary shelter of other people's porches. The route the clerk provided led out of town and into an increasingly solitary landscape. The trail grew faint, and the scrub thickened into a sun-baked patchwork of sagebrush and rock. Miles folded beneath Silver's hooves before the ranch rode into view late in the afternoon light, and Charlotte's first reaction was a raw, bitter disappointment. The house leaned inward at a weary angle, and its porch was missing boards, as if the structure itself had given up on a duty it could no longer fulfill. The barn tilted, its roof sagging like an old man's hat. Fencing lay in tangles like a net cast aside, and tumbleweeds had been allowed to pile against doorways and fence posts. The place would not be described as neat or pleasing, and the initial sight made a tightness at Charlotte's throat. Yet when her boots touched the ground, there was the stubborn fact that it belonged to her now. Ownership brought a rush of defiant hope. She led Silver to the well and set the pump into motion, struggling against the stiff lever until water, cold and clear, sputtered out into the bucket. It was small mercy, but it was a mercy. Water that could be used to cook, to drink, to wash the grit out of clothes and the dust from the throats of tired animals. The front door of the house moved on its hinges as if to greet her or warn her, and Charlotte stepped inside despite the heaviness of the air, despite the smell of resignation and dust. Sunlight carved bars through gaps in the roof and painted the dust particles as if they were suspended stars. The furniture remained as if the previous occupants had fled mid-dinner. A table, chairs, an iron bed frame under a quilt long faded. The stove in the kitchen looked serviceable. A few tin plates and cups lingered like relics of someone else's lives. The place was mournful, but it was not beyond repair. Charlotte set her saddle and supplies down, spread her bedroll on the floor, and allowed herself a fatigue that was bone-deep but uncomplicated. Before night fully fell, she wandered to the barn to make an evaluation of its condition and to look out for any immediate hazards. The barn's interior was larger than its exterior suggested. Stalls stretched back into a shadowed depth, and a loft rose above where sunlight filtered in through time-worn slats. Most stalls held nothing but old straw and the ghosts of occupation, but one stall betrayed recent life. Fresh manure lay there, dark and odoriferous. This small sign of life sent Charlotte's hand to the pistol at her hip, the town's caution and cowgirl's instinct combining into a readiness. A voice of authority told anyone who might be there to make their presence known. The voice was soft but firm and included the fact of ownership and armament. The barn replied not with a human voice but with an animal sound. A low snort and the shuffle of heavy weight. In the gloom of the last stall was a horse, larger than any Charlotte had seen up close. Dust and neglect had clung to his coat, but beneath that neglect the lines of strength were unmistakable. Powerful hindquarters, a broad chest, and a head shaped with a refinement that betrayed good breeding somewhere in the animal's past. The color was a deep, glowing rusty brown that caught what little light filtered in and seemed to burn softly rather than shine. Most striking among the horse's qualities were his eyes, dark, steady, and intelligent in a way that made Charlotte's breath stall. This horse was not merely frightened or feral. He was measuring her with the same cool assessment she extended to him, weighing threat, benefit, and the possibility of partnership. It was after a moment of mutual stillness that Charlotte spoke again, gentler this time. The horse's ears twitched toward the sound of her voice rather than away, and in that twitch Charlotte found the faintest hope. The animal was in rough shape, ribs showing beneath a coat matted with dirt and burrs, hooves in need of attention, mane tangled in knots from neglect. But even in that state, his presence radiated a dignity that angered Charlotte on behalf of him. Whoever had allowed this animal to fall into such condition had done him a grave wrong. There existed in small, sharp corners of the frontier a rough justice that disliked cruelty, and Charlotte felt that justice warming in her stomach as she decided to set the horse's needs as a priority. She did not yet have a legal claim to the animal. Technically, he could belong to the previous occupants of the ranch or to someone else entirely. In some places, the law still treated taking an unclaimed horse as theft, with severe consequences. Yet the moral question loomed larger for Charlotte than the legal one in that moment. If a living being needed help and no one else was coming to offer it, a decision fell to whoever stood there with the capacity to act. She left the barn with an intention to return in the morning after securing the house for the night, and when the cold stars wheeled above through the broken roof, she set her bedroll on the floor and listened to the barn's occasional sounds. There was movement there in the dark, the quiet reassurance of the horse's presence. Charlotte slept in short cycles and dreamed lightly, sometimes of fences and sometimes of open trails back to places that no longer fit. Dawn arrived earlier than expected, announced by roosters that the property had once supported and perhaps still retained somewhere in its memory. Charlotte moved like an old machine, finding its rhythm again, starting a fire in the stove and forcing down a hard tack and dried beef while she measured what supplies remained. There was food for a week if rationed carefully, a little grain for silver, and $17.32 in cash to her name, besides the single dollar that had purchased the deed. Not much, but experience had taught that little fortunes can be coaxed from modest means when work is the currency. After cleaning some things in the kitchen and packing a bucket with water, Charlotte returned to the barn where Silver nickered, and the big horse stood with an alertness that made the hair on her forearms lift. Morning revealed more detail. The rust-colored coat glowed with a burnished quality when the sun hit it just so, and the mane and tail were long and teeming with material that, if untangled, might prove impressive. When water was set near the stall for him, he watched it rather than drinking immediately, a sign of reluctance and caution, not malice. Charlotte began with basic chores and kept up a steady stream of calm words, knowing that horses learn voices like maps. She worked to muck the stall, to clear away the old straw, and to repair whatever broken latch would allow the animal to be stabled with dignity. While she worked, she spoke to him, naming herself and unrelated facts in the same breath, as if a running narrative were a kind of proof against sudden absence. He responded at first with small movements that measured distance and threat. Charlotte realized names matter even if animals do not speak. A name can be an offering of recognition. She chose Rusty for now, a plain name that fit the animal's coat and felt like a starting point for trust. That first day and the days that followed were a slow, methodical labor of repair. The barn loft yielded a surprising amount of fair hay. The shelves of the shed produced nails and odd tools that with effort could be made to serve. Charlotte spent long hours on her feet in the sun repairing fence posts with boards salvaged from collapsed outbuildings, building short stretches of secure perimeter rather than trying to restore every mile of tattered wire at once. The house received equal attention. Boards were pried loose where the roof sagged and replaced as best as hands allowed. The stove received cleaning and a test fire, and the rooms were swept and aired when the wind favored such action. Above all, Charlotte kept small rituals that were as much about human sanity as they were about animals and buildings. Water placed where thirsty mouths could find it, a slower voice when approaching a wary head, a small ration of oats or apples given with a flat palm rather than thrust into a fist. Rusty's responses moved in increments that could have been missed had Charlotte not learned to notice the tiny shifts that mark progress. After a few days, he would drink from a bucket set near him. After a week, he would take a small handful of apple and chew it with deliberate care. After 10 days, he allowed a tentative touch along the neck, a test that led to acceptance. The first true breakthrough came on a day when Charlotte had been singing an old hymn beneath her breath while replacing boards in a section of the barn. Her voice was soft and had traveled the long road from the farmhouse where she had grown up to wherever she now found herself. When she looked up mid-task, she discovered Rusty standing only a few feet away, head lowered in what could only be called curiosity rather than fear. She sat down on the dusty floor, making herself smaller and less imposing, and resumed singing in a soft, slow rhythm. Over the course of that long minute, the horse eased forward until his whiskers met Charlotte's outstretched palm. The contact sent a hot, unexpected swell of relief through her, and it marked the beginning of a relationship that would define life on this ranch for years to come. With trust slowly building, Charlotte set to work addressing deeper issues. Rusty bore evidence of a hard past, rope burns along his flanks, scars that read like maps of bad training and worse treatment, and hooves that had been neglected to the point of soreness. Her hands grew skilled at the kind of careful cleaning and treatment that can restore both body and confidence. She applied salves to wounds, trimmed hooves as best she could, and oversaw a diet that prioritized the animal's recovery without overwhelming his system. As health returned, so did dignity, and the horse's carriage lifted. He moved with a renewed confidence and a steadiness that had been missing in the first days. The ranch, however, did not stay under a benign sky. The arrival of a woman running a property alone disturbed a few local men who measured social order by who did what and who belonged where. Not everyone was content with Charlotte's presence. On a trip into town for supplies, Charlotte encountered Mr. Briggs, the weathered general store owner, who studied her with a blend of curiosity and respect. He spoke plainly. Folks around here were likely to underestimate or challenge a woman who tried to make a go of a ranch. Some felt threatened by the idea that she might succeed where they expected failure, and others simply believed a woman could not do the work. Briggs warned her to be careful and offered practical advice and the possibility of quiet support. As Charlotte rode from town with supplies on silver and needed goods stacked in saddle bags, laughter and derisive calls followed her out of town from a group of men who had been drinking in the saloon. Small stings like those leave marks that accumulate into a defensive awareness. 2 weeks into this new life, the tension escalated. While Charlotte repaired a trough near the yard, Rusty moved between her and the road with an agitation that made her uneasy, and then 3 riders appeared over the rise and came onto her property like a challenge. The leader was a red-faced man bulked with a swagger and an idea of entitlement. He introduced himself as Tom Hackett, and with the politeness of someone practicing a bedrock insult, offered to buy the land back for $20. The offer was shaped like a mockery: take the profit with dignity removed, and no one would be bothered further. Charlotte refused. The refusal sparked a threat thinly disguised as neighborly advice. Bodies and voices in that landscape were used to making things happen by force when law and reason did not favor them. One of the riders spat in the dirt and made the horses give an ugly laugh at the idea of a woman defending a property. They left with a last menacing line about how things tend to go wrong for people who do not have friends in that country, and their departing form had the comfortable bounce of men who believed they could drive someone out by making living unbearable. In the days that followed, Charlotte found boots prints near the barn at dawn, tools missing when she left them, and the humiliation of a dead coyote hung on her gate as a whispered warning. Each incident carried the same note. Someone was trying to push her toward leaving. Rusty responded with growing protectiveness. He shadowed Charlotte's steps in the pasture and remained close to the house when night fell instead of returning to the stall he had lived in for months or years. The bond that had formed between them hardened into something like partnership. Each watched the other and acted with a tacit understanding. Charlotte filed a formal complaint with the sheriff after the night. An arson attempt turned the eastern pasture into a sheet of orange light under a blank moon. Riders had been silhouetted by the flames, circling as if practicing for a show of dominance designed to destroy the place. Charlotte worked like a cyclone against the fire, hauling water, beating at flames, and digging a fire break until her lungs protested. Rusty proved to be more than muscle and reaction. He was a partner in desperate labor, stamping small fires with hooves and staying close enough that Charlotte could use him as an anchor when exhaustion started to overtake her. The sheriff listened to Charlotte's story with politeness beyond action. Evidence was thin and ties ran deep, and despite a tone that suggested regret, he could offer little beyond a suggestion to sell and move on. That lack of institutional support was a harsh reality for someone who had just become responsible for 300 acres, with limited resources and no ready allies. The hostility ratcheted upward until a black night in late September when an arson attack lit the fields. Riders charged like shadows with torches and hot intent, and Charlotte found herself a single figure against a growing inferno. She fired shots into the air to break the riders' rhythm and used her rifle to hit torches when she could, but the numbers were against her. Rusty answered the call as if something deeper in him understood the stakes. He charged into the group of men with a fury that scattered their horses like leaves. The attack turned into a violent dance, Charlotte trying to put out flames and aim at torches while Rusty created openings by scattering the riders. The battle thickened and fear multiplied until, from the direction of town, the sound of hoofbeats rose like an answered prayer. Mr. Briggs appeared first, his age no match for the vigor in his horse and the steadiness of the shotgun across his saddle. Behind him came a handful of townspeople, armed and steady, ready to stand for a principle that had been roughly defined in the past as neighborly defense. The attackers broke and fled when they realized the population had rallied against them and that the simple calculus of intimidation had shifted. In the quiet that followed, the smoke lay low and the long breath of relief was ragged. Rusty bore a shallow wound across his shoulder where metal had grazed him, but his spirit remained intact and his loyalty deeper than a mere animal's response. He pressed his head into Charlotte's shoulder while she begrimed and stitched as best she could, and the encounter became a turning point. The townspeople's intervention changed the dynamic. Where harassment had been tolerated or shrugged away, now words carried a different weight. Meat-of-fact respect replaced some of the earlier mockery, partly because courage tends to reframe conversation, and partly because the image of a woman and a large stallion fighting together settled into local memory as more than rumor. Tom Hackett and his associates left the area in the weeks that followed, deciding the risk of further conflict outweighed the benefit of trying to push out someone the townspeople might protect. That reprieve did not signal an end to hard work. Charlotte kept a steady rhythm of chores and repairs that, day by day, turned the ranch from a failing claim into a functioning operation. Fences were mended with a focus on the most urgent stretches first. The barn received a stronger roof and fresh stalls. The house's leaking roof was patched and then replaced as resources allowed. She managed a calf-to-cow program that in time produced a small but steady herd, and she planted a garden whose first season produced a modest yield that made dry stew into something like a meal. Small successes mattered. They built endurance by becoming reliable facts rather than wished-for possibilities. Rusty became a central presence in every aspect of this work. He was the steady mount for quick rides when cattle needed gathering, and the early warning system for any unusual presence on the property. He learned to accept bridling and saddling, and became a partner in the measured, patient labor of moving stock. His transformation from wary survivor to muscular partner was a daily reminder that care returns strength. People who had once surprised Charlotte with their scorn began, slowly and carefully, to offer practical assistance. A loan tool here, a suggestion there, a young man hired to help with the heavy lifting during hay season. A teenage girl who wanted to learn the craft of ranching was allowed to visit, and under Charlotte's steady instruction, the girl's hands learned the small and precise work of branding, fencing, and animal care, skills passed from one generation to the next not through grand lessons, but through steady repetition and accessible patience. It became clear that tending the land involved more than patching roofs or mending fences. It required forging human ties that could block future attempts at intimidation. Charlotte, who had spent years drifting, found in these tentative relationships a form of belonging she had not expected to want or need. The work paid off in simple measures. The pastures thickened as torn patches revegetated, the cattle thrived, the house warmed into a livable center rather than a temporary shelter, and the barn regained the orderly bustle of a place that served life instead of merely sheltering it. Rusty gained weight and spirit in equal measure, his coat turning from dusty and dulled to glossy with care. Yet despite all the progress, the record of his past remained elusive. No one in the county could say where he had come from or who had once owned him. There were guesses and half-remembered rumors, but no documentation and no claimants brave enough to step forward. In the end, the lack of a paper trail did not matter as much as a different and sturdier fact. Two creatures, a woman and a horse, had found one another and had chosen to stay. Time built a patina of stability. 2 years after that single dollar had purchased the deed, the ranch wore its improvements like quiet armor. Fences were solid, the barn and house repaired, and the pasture a lush green that drew deer and birds for the promise of water and shelter. Charlotte had paid back the back taxes and had saved a small sum for contingencies. She had hired help for the heavy work, enough to prevent exhaustion from becoming a permanent condition. She had taken a young woman under her wing, teaching and mentoring in a way that would have been easy to miss, but which nonetheless spread knowledge and possibility. The town's attitude had shifted from skepticism to a grudging respect, and then to a supportive stance born of shared reality. People who once spat at the idea of a woman on a ranch met her in town with nods and the quiet overtures of mutual aid. Stories began to spread about a woman who bought a ranch for $1 and kept it through sweat and grit, and about the rusty stallion who fought by her side during the worst nights. These stories were told over fence rails and at counters, retold to newcomers and repeated in the evenings, where people gather to remind themselves that story and truth are often the same thing in small places. On a spring morning almost 2 years after the purchase, Charlotte stood on the porch with a cup of coffee warming her hands and looked out over the pasture where Rusty grazed among a small herd of contented cattle. The wounds left by the arson had long healed, the soil softened into a thick thatch of grass that fed both livestock and the occasional deer passing through. The scene was the result of relentless work, of setbacks met with renewed effort, and of a stubborn refusal to allow threats to decide who got to stay. Rusty lifted his head and trotted to the porch when called, the movement easy and sure now. He had become more than a helper. He was family in the practical sense of mutual reliance and affection. Charlotte met him without the theatrical show of greeting, and instead wrapped her arms around his neck in a gesture that had turned from novelty to ritual. The scent of grass and clean animal and sun filled the space between them, and in that minute, the value of what had been purchased for a single dollar became clear. The most valuable thing had not been the acreage itself, but the life that had been built on it, the relationships formed, and the partnership that had arisen from necessity and respect. The ranch's profitability was modest but steady, enough to keep the livestock healthy and the household supplied. and there was enough surplus at times to trade for improvements and to keep a weather eye out for better tools or a new section of fencing. The wealth it produced was not the kind printed in big figures, but the kind that allows a roof to keep the rain out and a family, however formed, to persist and grow. Rusty's past remained a quiet mystery. Who had raised him, who had first named him, what had been his training and his losses? The fact that nobody claimed him became part of the life at Willow Creek rather than a question to be solved in court. What mattered more than history was the daily reality of two beings who had survived and rebuilt together. In all the evenings that followed, the porch became a place not simply for rest but for planning, for the trade of work for task, and for the sharing of stories with those who had come to respect what had been achieved. Young hands learned the work, and old hands lent tools. The ranch stood as proof that small investments of courage and care can ripple outward and change more than a single plot of land. The legend of the Dollar Ranch and the rust-colored horse traveled beyond the county lines over time, retold around fires and over long meals as a tale of stubbornness and heart. The central image of a woman and a large stallion standing together against odds struck a chord. It became the kind of story people tell when they want to remind themselves that courage is not always loud and that partnership can be found in unexpected places. The transformation did not feel miraculous to those who lived it. It felt like the slow, unglamorous machining of work and trust. Yet the result had the shape of something larger than either the woman or the horse. A community that could be moved to stand when principle demanded it. A young person who found a teacher and a path forward. A property that sustained life and memory rather than decayed into a cautionary story. Sometimes the best investments are not measured in money, but in the willingness to claim responsibility when everyone else seeks to avoid it. The dollar Charlotte had spent in a county courthouse had bought a piece of land that allowed new kinds of belonging. The horse in the barn had been more than an animal. He had been a catalyst for a life built in partnership. Their story, told and retold, eventually became something like legend in that part of the country, a reminder that courage, steadiness, and mutual aid can rewrite what fear and prejudice have tried to fix in place. For anyone who finds this tale moving, subscribe, like, and share the video to pass this story along. Let the example of a horse and a determined person remind others that sometimes the smallest purchase can lead to the richest life.